When it comes to VR performance, the 5090 is unquestionably the king, enabling performance at resolutions which would have been previously unheard of in a realm not even the 4090 can touch. But that's the desktop card. What about the laptop 5090? Now, it goes without saying that a big fat desktop part which can slurp down a house fire starting 600 watts of power will be stronger than a GPU using 3.5 times less energy that is thinner than the heatsink of the desktop. So the question more is, how wide is that gap? Now, to provide some key context, it is important that we briefly look at the specs. As though the two GPUs may share the same name designation, well, the actual specs behind them, they are wildly different. Just briefly glancing at Nvidia's own comparison, the desktop variant has nearly double the CUDA core count, double the memory bus width, 8 gigabytes more VRAM, and a few hundred megahertz boost clock. That's quite the staggering difference. But there is a good reason for this. The RTX 5090 Mobile is actually using the same GB203 die that the desktop variant of the 5080 uses. And if we add the 5080 to the comparison, well, some of those numbers start looking pretty similar now, don't they? Namely, the memory bus and CUDA core count. It's natural to not have the same expectations of a laptop versus a desktop part, but already the raw specs do not inspire confidence that the laptop here is going to live up to that 5090 branding. But let's take a look at the numbers to confirm it. However, some important disclaimers and notes on testing methodology, given some of the issues comparing a desktop and laptop part. I had to choose a few different games from my usual selection of titles, as while the point of this video is comparing the 5090 in both form factors, the CPU in these two systems is very different, and there's only so much I could do about that. The laptop has an Intel-based Core Ultra, while the desktop has a 9950X3D. And certain places that I like to test that the desktop completely avoid being CPU bound, such as say VR chat, well, it gets significantly CPU bound on the laptop, which means it'd no longer be the GPU being compared as it would be held back by the CPU, and that would lead to a disproportionate advantage for the desktop that is not because of the graphics cards. And trust me, the desktop does not need any more edges. To avoid this, I did have to select some games which I ensured were entirely GPU limited, to the best I could at least. But titles like MSFS, DCS, VR Chat, even something like No Man's Sky, that range from extremely to lightly CPU bound. So I had to exclude them. Because of this, I have tried to make up for a bit by taking a deeper look at some of the games with 2 resolutions and various levels of anti-aliasing when possible instead of a wider approach. This is an incredibly powerful laptop, but it's still a laptop at the end of the day. And similar specs with the X3D CPUs at the time of when I bought it, it was a little under 2 times the price. I've also done a little dynamic foveated rendering with quad views and testing with Pimax's native OpenXR runtime as they finally appeared to have fixed the frame pacing issues it had before. But while I know that the current average FPS is always correct on quad views, I can't be 100% certain that the lows are reported with complete accuracy, as quad views via external injections, like say Pimax and quad views foveated does, has sometimes broken other measuring tools, like say FPS VR here, where you can only get the average and current FPS properly. Lows and the frame time measurements break since the program seemingly doesn't know how to deal with it. Not everything is like this, and I've used multiple tools from CatFrameX, FPSVR, OpenXR Toolkit, and XR Frame tools to be certain that the average FPS is correct, and I am also reasonably confident in the lows because those also line up in about everything I could test on DirectX 11 at least. DirectX 12, which some games like Metro Awakening run, it doesn't really work right with most of my measuring tools, and I only have CatFrameX. So again, I think the numbers are probably, or at least close enough, to be accurate to show based on other runtimes and my own experience. But I always liked having multiple tools to validate when possible, and that was a little bit difficult here. Alrighty then, with that all out of the way, let's get to the test configurations. First up is the desktop, which is running these specs, a desktop 5090, 9950X3D with 64 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. This is to compare with the laptop here, which is an Alienware Area 51 18-inch, housing a mobile full 5090, the Intel Core Ultra 275HX, and 64GB of DDR5 RAM. It was run in the overdrive mode at the max fan speed for the highest performance and to ensure no thermal throttling, which I verified. Both were run on the Pimax Crystal Super micro OLED module at both 5424 by 5356 per eye and 4068 by 4016 per eye. That corresponds to 1.0 and then 0.75 in the Pimax slider, which uses per axis scaling and is not the same as Steam VR's total res slider. So when I refer to res as fractional like 0.75, I'm talking the Pimax Play slider, whereas when it's percent based, well then that's Steam VR slider. So let's dive right in, see how this fares, and see if one of the best gaming laptops on the planet can stack up to the desktop 5090. Let's start things off with a little easier but still great looking VR game with Kayak VR Mirage, run at cinematic settings. In the case of Kayak VR, the desktop 5090 is already smashing into the headset's hertz limits, or close to it at least, with the full 1.0 res. So only the laptop needed to be tested at 0.75 to see how it performed. With TAA, the laptop reaches 90 FPS average, but it does have a few dips. But with MSAA, the laptop immediately falters, going from a nice 90 down to 65. With a little tweaking, as we are at max settings, the laptop could provide a 72 Hz with some dips kind of experience, but the 1.0 resolution is a brutal blowout. With TAA, the desktop is completely frame rate limited at 90. In fact, it has so much headroom I can super sample to 150% resolution before average FPS dips below 90, with the lows keeping up quite well, whereas the laptop can't break 60 FPS average at 100% res. Things are far worse with MSAA, where the laptop has frames in the 30s. Unplayable, really, while the desktop more than doubles its performance in every single metric and is still an excellent time with even lows in the 70s. A few tweaks and you could likely hit a good 90 FPS experience, with a couple dips that is, but there is no salvaging the laptop with MSAA on, at least without some help. Kayak VR can be used with quad-use foveated rendering if you use the launch command -hmd equals openxr and install quad-use foveated, or if your headset manufacturer has an ability to natively use it, such as with Pimax's native openxr runtime. So I'm still testing it with the Steam VR defaults here. Using this, the laptop's performance soars, with the previously unplayable MSAA not quite doubling, but it's seeing 78 to 87% improvement on each metric. It's actually a decent experience in this kind of game now. The gains are less drastic with TAA, lows only 21 to 25% better, while average FPS is 46% improved, but we're bordering on hitting our headset's hertz rate, but the lows have some notable dips, so 72 Hz mode may be preferred. There's no reason not to test this on the desktop as well though, so going up to the absolute resolution cap for Steam VR of 8192 on any axis, the desktop is still constrained by the 90 Hz cap with TAA. MSAA was a similar story. So I use Pimax's native OpenXR runtime, which can go much higher with its 2.0 resolution, just a bit under 11K by 11K per eye, before considering quad views, multiple viewpoints, and res, using the Ultra preset. This still produced playable performance, which is better than any run with a laptop at 1.0 without it, though Pimax's default settings have far too obvious foveation in my opinion, but raising the peripheral res does make it a lot less noticeable. I am still experimenting on a good value for their native use via the customization sliders, so for now I'm just sticking with the most usable preset. So after that easy start, let's have a game which destroys both cards. Riven. At 0.75 res, it's kind of a bad time all around. The laptop, native OpenXR or not, cannot keep even 45 FPS average for motion smoothing, but that'd still be a bad idea with lows in the 20s. The desktop, meanwhile, is at least providing a playable experience since average FPS is reaching into the 80s, but there are some bad dips in the lows, which in VR doesn't make for the best experience. Still, next to the laptop, it's an 81 to 94% improvement, enough to at least enjoy the game if you can live with some drops, or target 72 Hz mode for a slightly more consistent experience. But at 1.0, I wouldn't say either card is really that playable. The desktop barely cracks 50 FPS average, with dips to the 30s on lows, while the laptop performance is around half that of the desktop. Interestingly though, if we compare the Steam VR OpenXR to native OpenXR results, it's all mostly within a few percent, but there is one odd trend. They're essentially identical at 1.0 res one way or the other. The laptop is 1 to 3% worse with the native runtime though, while the desktop is 1 to 3% in favor of it. However, at lower resolution, the margins do grow slightly, but still noticeably. On the desktop 5090, native OpenXR has around 5% better, 0.1% low in average FPS, though the 1% is only 1.7% different, whereas the laptop has a native runtime perform 4% better in all but the 0.1% low, which is about identical. Interesting find and something to check more someday. Perhaps the runtime differences matter more at lower resolution than a higher one for whatever reason. Concerning the lows, they appear to be caused by one specific area in the run. As recording with an overlay, mind the slight penalty here, when going inside this large chamber, frame rate tanks significantly compared to outside. So it's not necessarily as if Riven is constantly stuttering, just that some areas are vastly more intensive. Back to an older VR game, but a well-optimized one the laptop might have a chance of playing well, we have Half-Life Alyx on the Ultra Fidelity preset with dynamic resolution disabled. And things are really good here. There's only 1.0 res to look at because even the laptop was completely frame rate limited at MSAA times 4 at 0.75 res, so there's not really much to compare there. At said full resolution, the laptop is struggling a bit though, but it's holding up incredibly well considering the other game results. MSAA times 4 I would say is a bit much for it, but turn down a few settings and use 72Hz mode, you can have a pretty decent experience. Going to MSAA times 2 sees every metric rise by about 12 to 17%, and it would take some more compromises on saying your resolution, but hitting 90Hz with some dips isn't out of the question. Though 0.1% low in the 30s do hurt, however. Curiously, the desktop suffers a similar fate. It's solidly frame rate limited, even with MSAA times 4, with incredibly placed 1% low, but there's a 36% gap between those and the 0.1%. Dropping to MSAA times 2 doesn't fix this either, it only improves by about 8%, but we'll talk about the 0.1% low more in a bit. Concerning the laptop versus desktop, given we're so frame rate limited, and even the laptop does reasonably well, the desktop 5090 can't fully flex its might, but given the odd 0.1% low, we can see a glimpse of that, as the desktop 5090 is doing 80% better comparing MSAA times 4 runs. I did choose Alyx for another reason though, and that's that it responds well to the other form of foveated rendering Pimax offers, or central priority rendering as they call it. I had to turn MSAA down to times 2 since it's bugged with times 4, but the gains are quite stand out here. The laptop goes from what could be a 72 FPS with slight dips experience to 90 with some drops. The average FPS at 1% low only rise by 13 and 15% respectively, but the 0.1% low do see an astounding jump up by 32%. It's not a perfect experience, but foveated rendering has minimal visibility here and lets the laptop hit a key threshold for VR. But now the desktop card has to make that look like a joke with DFR by the fact that it can go up to the literal resolution limit of Steam VR, nearly 8.2K on any axis per eye, 230% res here, and performance is still completely rock steady, nearing the same as it was at 100% without DFR. Regarding the 0.1% low that seemed capped at the mid-60s, even on the desktop, the cause seems like it may be right at this end segment. There is a robot which gets in your face to scan you, which results in significant frame drops for up to a few seconds out of a 4-minute run. These are brief, so in practice it's not any issue at all for regular gameplay, and overall both systems provide an at least good experience. For some more OpenXR and foveated rendering testing, we have Metro Awakening run on max settings with TAA. At 0.75 res, the laptop struggles to hold up to the desktop in Steam VR. The bigger 5090 is solidly limited by the 90 FPS of the headset, and it really shows in the average FPS being only 45% better, whereas the lows are 55 to 56% improved. But there are some strange OpenXR results. In the laptop's case, the native runtime is doing 4 to 5% better, but when it comes to the desktop results, it's doing worse on the lows. Steam VR is running 4% better on the 1% and a quite meaningful 15% better on the 0.1%. I don't know if Pimax may have potentially fixed issues when not frame rate capped and caused new ones, or if things may not be fully accurate on the lows due to the runtime differences, as Metro is DirectX 12 and some programs don't play nicely with that, but I don't have many other tools which can measure it to check against besides CapFrameX here. I don't want to interject too much personal opinion onto the numbers, but I'm usually decently sensitive to frame frame drops, and it didn't feel that bad here. At the full 1.0 resolution, the laptop simply collapses, however. FPS is in the low to mid 30s, and it makes for an utterly unplayable experience. It is in fact doing so poorly here that the desktop variant once again more than doubles the performance of the laptop in every metric, managing to reach performance which could make up pretty good 72Hz mode. A point of note once more is that for the desktop cards, the OpenXR runtimes are identical for native or Steam VR. 1% difference is just system noise, whereas the laptop saw 3% gains on the average and 1% low, then near 8% on the 0.1% low with the native runtime. Once again, OpenXR difference seems a little more noticeable at lower resolutions. But this is a game which Pimax can inject quad views into via their native runtime, as it does support DX12 versus 11 that quad views foveated runs on. And the laptop is completely transformed by this. Just 72Hz actually being a realistic goal since every metric jumps by 75 to 98%. It's in fact gone up so much that the laptop is now almost equaling the desktop 5090 without quad views granted, though the desktop does have about 13% better, 0.1% low. Of course, the desktop can also do this, so if we use foveated rendering with that, we manage to hit 90 FPS average, but the lows do have some dips. As I said in the disclaimers, external quad views injections has sometimes caused metric reporting to freak out on the lows and frame times, so this could possibly be what this is, or there might be frame pacing issues when hitting a locked refresh now on the native runtime, or it could be CPU spikes from the extra low quad views causes there. Just something to look more into. I don't know right now. I'll at least say the dips felt minimal in the headset despite being present. The artifacting for quad views does become a lot more noticeable under certain lighting conditions, but once more, raising the peripheral res makes it a lot less noticeable, and I think the gains are worth the few bits of flicker that are very minimal once you're past the prologue in chapter 1. And the last big title is Automobilista 2, run on all high settings with a 21 car track in heavy cloud weather. And by now it's quite a similar story, but the laptop struggles to keep up even at 0.75 res. The desktop card is capable of incredible frame rates, slamming the headset's 90 FPS limit even with medium AA, which I believe is times 4 MSAA, and quite well paced lows, or also with TAA. Only high MSAA, which if medium is 4x, this should be 8x, finally begins to make it stumble below our target 90. Meanwhile, the laptop is doing so poorly that the desktop has, yet again, double performance in the lows at the same settings, with the margins once more limited by the fact it can't measure higher. The only run on the laptop I'd argue could have a chance of becoming a playable one would be that with no AA. We are at higher settings, so perhaps by dropping some, you could have a chance of a reasonable 72Hz experience. But anti-aliasing of any kind, I think, just costs too much. Bizarrely, though, if we look at TAA and medium MSAA, they perform around the same on the laptop, which is odd because TAA is generally much more lightweight a solution than MSAA. It's the case on the desktop too, but that's dealing with Hertz limitations, so whatever. 1.0 is just a humiliation ritual for the laptop, though. Without any forms of AA, it's at 42.93 FPS, not even in motion smoothing range. Meanwhile, the desktop isn't hitting 90 FPS, but it's actually not that far off at nearly 85 average and reasonably good lows. That 0.1% low in the 60s ain't the best though. But even still, the margins are, for the third time in this video, roughly double or more the laptop variant of the card. That's really not much else to say, as this extends to every single comparison. The desktop card does buckle once you use AA, but it could still do a good 72Hz mode with a few compromises or simply lower levels of MSAA. Now, the desktop isn't bound by Hertz limitations. Like the laptop before it, we can see that TAA and medium MSAA are performing identically. This is the only case I've ever seen something like this. TAA universally perform much better than MSAA in every other game I've tested, though it does tend to come with the trade-offs of blurred visuals. I don't know if this is down to implementation or what, but I reran this several times on both systems and I got similar results every time, on this and with FPS VR. So the numbers check out. All right, let's talk about some key takeaways, because I think there's kind of two ways to look at this. Firstly, Plain and simple, the 5090 laptop is a complete world apart from the desktop. In 3 out of the 5 games tested, the desktop managed to more than double it when not bound by Hertz limitations, that is. And even in games which the laptop did well in, such as Half-Life Alyx, where it was actually just shy of delivering 72 Hz at max settings and MSA 8x4, the desktop just killed it with a rock-steady 90 FPS under the same conditions. I know that the 5090 is a unique card for VR with its utterly monstrous memory bandwidth, which coincidentally is double the laptop and around the highest margins we see, and expecting the same performance in a much thinner package is stupid. But when two things share the same name and there's not some 5090M or laptop-specific branding that is very clear in everything, and Nvidia used to have this, a name comes with certain expectations, I think. Expectations which this laptop here comes nowhere close to living up to. The only things which truly made the desktop break at full res was Riven and AMS2 running the highest MSAA. And both of those were still playable going down to 0.75 res or using lighter anti-aliasing. However, I think the other side of this is that if we look at performance on its own merits and what the laptop manages for being vastly more portable and consuming less power, I actually do think there is a lot to be impressed by and praised. The full 1.0 res of over 5K by 5K per eye is completely beyond this system on all but the most absolute black magic optimized games, like Alyx, or if you're using foveated rendering, which then can actually bring it somewhat into the ballpark of the desktop 5090 without using it. But the around 4K by 4K per eye range of 0.75 res, a resolution which is, again, noticeably higher than render targets of things such as the Quest 3 and the big screen beyond, this actually does okay, even good in light to moderately demanding titles. It still didn't quite hit the threshold for 72 Hz in a few cases, but that was when running these games at high or even max settings that you could lower, and a few times even 90 Hz could be possible. Sure, the most demanding stuff is still going to kill this thing. And if you look at something like Riven with FPS in the 40s, but that can make even the desktop 5090 wheeze, and I still find the fact a laptop of any kind being able to deliver a good, if not perfect, experience in somewhat demanding titles at higher settings, at resolutions that only the highest res current stuff on the market really shoots past, I think that's pretty incredible. I've had many laptops over the years from warranty upgrades, and the GPUs in those that I've used in VR have ranged from a 3070, a 3080, 3080 Ti, and then the 5090. In fact, I even have some older videos where I tested things like the 3080 on a Quest 2 and the 3080 Ti with the original Crystal. Even in ultra-optimized titles like Half-Life Alyx, running even lower resolutions with foveated rendering, the 3080 Ti just it had no chance of delivering a solid experience. Whereas this thing does, even without it. For the first time, really, I feel like I can use my laptop without needing some of the lowest resolution currently offered in the market or severe compromises that are going to ruin the experience outside the most simple titles. And since I've started using VR, my desktop GPUs over time have been the 3080, the 3090 Ti, the 4090, and the 5090. And this provides a noticeably better experience than the 3090 Ti ever did. I'd even say it feels closer to the 4080 than it does the 3090 Ti, even if the 4090 card is still noticeably better. It doesn't quite match the higher end cards, but like this is upper level desktop performance you can fit comfortably in a backpack. It does make me wonder where we might be in a few more generations, actually. Maybe running even more demanding games in a laptop at super high resolution VR, it's going to be viable then. This could already make a pretty interesting portable VR station with those super small form factor headsets. Just don't expect 5090 desktop performance because the laptop shares the name. But with the way prices are trending, by that future generation, a laptop is probably going to cost more than a house. This is already almost 50% more than when I bought it on sale. Jesus Christ, this hobby is so screwed. Anyway, there is the video. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching and consider sticking around to see what I do next. If not, well, thank you for making it to the end, and maybe I'll see you again sometime in the recommendeds. Later.